Welcome to the fall semester 2021 iREAD at Washburn University. iREAD has existed at Washburn University now for about 15 years. This is our common reading program where we find a distinguished author whose book we read as a community, and then that author joins us to talk about her work. iREAD is a really special thing at Washburn because we do not have a large number of shared learning experiences. This is such an experience. It's an experience where all of us together read the same book, think about that book, discuss that book, and then learn from the author in real time. We're very fortunate today that Dr. Nancy Bristow is joining us, the author of American Pandemic. She has published other works, including Making Men Moral, Social Engineering During the Great War, and she is a 20th century historian who focuses on race and social change. She's very interested, just like all of us, in people and Americans and how they deal with the world in which they live. She's going to talk to us today about her book, some lessons from it, and then when we're done, you'll have an opportunity to submit some questions that she'll answer for us at a later date. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Nancy Bristow to iREAD and thanking her for her willingness to join us in this learning experience. Dr. Bristow, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Behrman. And I have to say, it is such an honor to be with all of you today and to have American Pandemic selected as the text for Washburn's iREAD program. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So it's going to take me just a moment to get set up here, and then we'll be underway. As I say, I am absolutely elated to be with all of you today. And it's especially meaningful for me because of this program's grounding in this idea of shared experiences and their importance. As we've weathered COVID-19, we've often needed to stay apart from one another. Evidenced, for instance, by the fact that I'm talking to you by screen today. And I'm sorry I'm not there with you in person, but it's precisely because of all of that having to be distanced that it feels all the more special to have this chance together, even virtually, to think together about the meaning of this past pandemic of 1918 and how it can help us see our own experience with COVID in new ways. I want to offer my deep, deep thanks to those who've made this possible, especially to Dr. Alan Behrman for the invitation, for all of his work organizing it, for his kind introduction. And I want to express gratitude to those sponsors who make the iREAD program possible and all of the faculty, staff, and students who are participants. Together, you've built a shared experience for us all. So it's my job, I guess, to try to make it matter. As I begin, I do want to offer a land acknowledgement. I join you today from the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. It's situated on the unceded land that's part of the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish people, and more specifically of the Puyallup tribe of Indians. They're known as the welcoming and generous people, and that name is well earned. They continue to act as wise and careful stewards of their land and of the sea, and they continue to honor and engage their ancient heritage and to welcome us to their land. I offer my deep respect to them and gratitude and acknowledge their commitment as well as mine to their ongoing struggle for justice. And now to the story of two pandemics. Now, I know you all have read some or all of American Pandemic, so I'm going to just start in here with a couple of stories and then set up my lecture for you. So first, in the midst of the influenza pandemic of 1918, the Baltimore Afro-American detailed the cost of one of what it described as the most pitiable cases of racism that had occurred that far in the crisis. The paper described the struggle of finding space in one of the city's Black hospitals, the overcrowded Providence Hospital, for an unknown man who was found unconscious, and they needed a volunteer to take care of him. This, the paper concluded, is one of the extremely sad cases that are the pitiable result of the Jim Crow policy practiced in white hospitals of the city, end quote. Now, fast forward to March 2020. About 18 months ago, Gary Fowler, a Black man living in Detroit, started feeling short of breath. His father had the coronavirus, so he understood the likelihood that he too was infected. And he visited 3 different emergency rooms, pleading for care as well as for a test. He was turned away each time, told he was probably just suffering from bronchitis or that he could get better help somewhere else, or he should go home and drink water. It became more and more difficult for him to breathe. He began sleeping in a recliner, and his wife slept right alongside in the couple's bed. Sometime during the night of April 6th, he wrote down heartbeat irregular and oxygen level low. And the next morning, his wife found him dead. He was only 56. Now, the world in which Gary Fowler lived and died, our world, is certainly different from that which suffered through the 1918 pandemic. And perhaps most obviously, given these two stories, we've established much greater equity before the law. The kind of legalized segregation and discrimination that the Baltimore Afro-American described is now illegal. We've also made sizable scientific advances, things that really should have predicted much better outcomes for us in the face of our current pandemic. And yet, as the story of Mr. Fowler illustrates, what's been most striking to me is as we face this pandemic in 2020 and 2021, is how closely it has mirrored really many of the experiences of those of 1918, including, for instance, the reality that thousands of Americans have died and that suffering and loss has been inequitably distributed. So here's what I want to do with you today. First, I want to build on what you already know. I'm not going to recount everything that's in my book. You've already got familiarity with that, I suspect. Instead, I want to talk about a comparison. I want to put our experiences today in the context of what happened in 1918. I'll talk a little bit about some of the differences, and there are important differences, but I want to focus most of my time on 4 similarities that I found really quite stunning. And those 4 would be Americans' overconfidence as we face the initial challenge of a pandemic, the scattershot approach that we've taken in our public health responses, how our pandemics in both cases became politicized, and as a result, there were great costs. And finally, the powerful role played by social identity in shaping this disparate consequence that I was just talking about. And as I wrap up, hopefully, I can articulate a few insights perhaps that these comparisons and parallels suggest to us, maybe some lessons we might think about taking along with us as we dream of our post-pandemic world. So first, some differences. As the coronavirus exploded around the world last year, we met the crisis with significant scientific advantages compared to 1918. One of the most important, of course, was that we had a century worth of public health knowledge that offered us very clear guidance on how best to respond to a viral threat like COVID. In fact, it was data from 1918 that made clear how promising some of the tools at our disposal really are. In 2007, a group of historians from the University of Michigan, as well as someone from the Public Health Service, had published research based in data from 43 cities during the 1918 pandemic. And what they learned very clearly was the communities that imposed non-pharmaceutical interventions, or NPIs, you can throw that around when you want to sound smart. NPIs were things like school closures, the prohibition of public gatherings, and the isolation and quarantining of the sick. Cities that used NPIs and did so early and sustained and in a layered way had significantly lower death rates than other cities. Now, this is pretty important in the context of 2020, because in slowing the pace of the pandemic, flattening the curve, as we would call it today, we have some real advantages. We have ventilators, for instance. These can help people breathe, lives that would have been saved in 1918 if they'd had this technology. But the key to that is that we have to have enough of them to go around. So if we can slow the spread of the disease, which is what these NPIs make possible, we can make sure that a greater number of people have access to this life-saving technology. Another big advantage, of course, is that we could find the virus. In 1918, they didn't yet have that kind of technology. They suspected there was such a thing as a virus, but they could only see things as small as bacteria. That means they could not find a vaccine, though they tried desperately hard to do so. We, alternatively, as we all well know, have a vaccine. So in our context, flattening the curve also meant, quite simply, fewer infections and then by fewer deaths in the months while we waited for that vaccine to be available. So those are some pretty significant differences that we went into this pandemic carrying, some real advantages, I'd say. And that's what, for me, makes the similarities so striking. So let me turn to those parallels. And I'm guessing some of these will be things that you've already noticed as well. Parallel one, this should not be happening to us, or what I'll call American hubris. As you know, the first wave of the 1918 pandemic, which perhaps had its origins right there in Kansas in Haskell County in the southeastern corner of the state, swept through the United States in the spring of that year, largely unnoticed and unheralded. It was just indistinguishable for the general public from regular seasonal flu. But the virus gained a lot of public attention as it made its way with American troops to the Western Front, where it sickened soldiers and then civilians, and soon spread around the world. Mutating into the deadly form that we associate with the 1918 pandemic, the influenza virus then struck in a second wave that everyone noticed when it struck simultaneously in late August in Sierra Leone, in France, and in the United States. Americans were shocked by what they experienced that fall. Part of the surprise was due to the characteristics of the H1N1 virus. It spread rapidly, covering not only the country, but the globe in just 2 months. It had a shockingly high infection rate. Roughly 1/3 of Americans were infected by, 1/3 of people worldwide and about 1/4 of Americans, were infected. And it killed with a rate 10 times that of seasonal flu. In turn, it seemed to strike the young and healthy with special force, claiming, as you can see with this graph, almost half of its victims among young people between the ages of 20 and 40, wreaking havoc, of course, on both families and communities. And in turn, it was an ugly illness to witness. And though patients might suffer a week or 10 days of illness, people might also wake up in the morning healthy and be dead before nightfall. Even the most traveled military physicians admitted to being startled and alarmed by what they saw. Regular people like you and I were stunned as well, describing the pandemic as a cyclone, a storm, a horrible nightmare. Sometimes, though, the way they described the pandemic suggested a bit of a critique of modern science as well, as Americans compared the flu pandemic to a plague of olden times, or suggested that it was just like those plagues that they had once seen before. These comments suggested that such a thing was not really supposed to be happening to 20th century Americans. And there were reasons they felt that way. Over the preceding half century, bacteriological research had led to revolutions in both public health and medicine. Scientists had identified the causal agents of many infectious diseases. They confirmed germ theory and enhanced the possibilities for prevention, and in some cases even cure. By the eve of the pandemic, they discovered the causal agent for things ranging from dysentery to malaria, from bubonic plague to whooping cough. And these advancements encouraged the already growing public health movement, so that by 1918, public health leaders were expressing quite a bit of serious confidence. Epidemics, one of them said, were now a thing of the past. In the early moments of the pandemic then, public health leaders' confidence led many to believe that they could contain it. As one suggested, we ought to be in time to prevent the epidemic from assuming severe proportions if there is anything to public health education at all. Physicians often sounded similarly optimistic tones early in the pandemic. Sometimes this confidence was mixed with a bit of American exceptionalism, the idea that while the pandemic might overwhelm other nations, the United States would emerge unscathed. As New York's health commissioner asked his fellow citizens in mid-August, just before the second wave hit, "You haven't heard of our doughboys," the nickname for American soldiers, "getting it, have you? You bet you haven't, and you won't." He said, "But you have heard of cases in the German army." He concluded that there was, quote, "no need for our people to worry over the matter," end quote. Such confidence didn't do anything to slow the pandemic, but it did slow the public health response. We've seen a similar sense of both overconfidence and surprise, I think, in the country in the early months of our own pandemic. On January 24th, 2020, in the very, very early days of the pandemic, Dr. Redfield, the current CDC head at the time, told US senators in a briefing, "We're prepared for this." At roughly the same time, Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, suggested in a radio interview that the coronavirus wasn't something the American people needed to be worried or frightened by. In fact, as the first coronaviruses arrived in the United States, a number of us, myself included, kept wanting to remind the American public about the dangers posed by influenza, which we assumed were still higher than the dangers posed by corona. Obviously, I was wrong. President Donald J. Trump, in turn, continued to downplay the threat in language reflecting a belief in the US's ability to dodge the pandemic, even as it spread around the globe. On January 29th, again, very early, he commented that we have the best experts anywhere in the world and they're on top of it 24/7. A month later, he said the coronavirus is very much under control in the USA. But he did convene a coronavirus task force and imposed a travel ban on China and initiated Operation Warp Speed, all important moves. But little other action followed, and instead he primarily continued to reassure. On March 2nd, he declared the United States is now ranked by far #1 in the world for preparedness. And a few days later noted that the US had fewer cases than many other countries and assured the public it will end. This overconfidence, again, was by no means limited to the Trump White House, but it was costly. So parallel 2. Unfortunately, our overconfidence, what I'll call our hubris, didn't lead to the rapid, coordinated national response that both 1918 and 2020 called for. Here's the thing. Viruses don't really care about national or state lines. Their need to reproduce is satisfied as easily by infecting a Kansan as a Nebraskan, a Washingtonian or an Oregonian, a New Yorker or a Vermonter. This means that the best way to fight an epidemic is with a carefully and comprehensively coordinated national response. Unfortunately, in both instances, the federal government had limited existing power to mandate a federally controlled pandemic response. And in each case, this led then, naturally, to the dispersal of efforts to manage the pandemic to state and local levels. Though in 1918 and in our own time, there have been many public health and political leaders who worked hard to mitigate the cost of the two medical crises, the reality is that the scattershot approach isn't the best one and had some devastating consequences. Now, again, there were some national efforts in 1918. As you know, the United States Public Health Service existed, and though it didn't have power to define policies or to put in place controls, it did have a central role in the distribution of educational material, roles, in fact, that it fulfilled really admirably. It distributed a great deal of information to local public health groups, for instance, which would disseminate to the public. From posters explaining basic sanitary practices to its weekly public health reports, the agency offered Americans informed and up-to-date information. And it also deployed its doctors and nurses to local areas in special need. Another non-governmental but very important organization that was closely tied to the government was the Red Cross, which also played a valuable role. It led efforts to solve the nursing crisis. It established and supplied emergency hospitals and kitchens. It provided transportation for patients and doctors, nurses, and supplies. It offered aid to families, and it educated the public. Professional organizations also stepped up, like the American Public Health Association, the American Medical Association, the American National Medical Association. All of them worked hard promoting education and also collecting data and conducting research. But the dispersal over public health in the end really meant that much of the decision-making and labor fell on state and local public health leaders. Here's some materials from New York City. Now, the Civil War had given significant inspiration to public health efforts, and in the wake of the war, several cities and states had established public health boards. The progressive era that came just before the war had reinforced this and encouraged the public's appreciation for the importance of public health, as we've discovered during the draft, the health problems confronting many, many Americans. But even so, when the pandemic broke out in 1918, the organization and power of public health forces varied enormously across the country, and this was reflected in wildly divergent responses to the crisis that emerged. Now, remarkably, the strategies available in 1918 for containing influenza were almost the same as those we're using today. Personal hygiene, public health education, closures, prohibitions on large gatherings, social distance, masking, ventilation, quarantining. This is all familiar ground to you all. And like today, again, each community's response was shaped by the variation in the power of state and local public health boards, the particular political environment of different communities, and the attitudes of the public. Some cities, like Seattle, Washington, or Milwaukee, Wisconsin, experienced strong public health and political leadership who created and sustained robust, layered, effective responses to the pandemic. In Kansas, too, citizens were really well served by their leadership, in particular that of the State Board of Health Executive Officer, Dr. Samuel J. Crumbine. Early on, the state board moved quickly to share information from the Public Health Service to local citizens about the illness, about modes of infection, and they urged citizens to mind their health, warning, quote, "The neglected cough often ends in a coffin." By October 9th, though, influenza had become serious around the state. In Topeka, 82 cases had emerged, and the city chose to close theaters, churches, schools, and the public library, quarantined the sick, began work on an emergency hospital, and placed bans on parties and other public gatherings, a ban, by the way, that included Washburn. A state ban and closure order followed almost immediately. Into late October, as the epidemic began to wane, Topeka's health officer, Dr. Clark, nevertheless continued to urge caution and reminded citizens that a few days of carelessness or assuming too quickly that the epidemic had passed could bring a recurrence. And the city kept its closures in place all the way until Armistice Day, November 11th. But not every city or state, of course, had such good leadership or such an effective response. In some communities, such as Newark, New Jersey, handling the pandemic was complicated by tensions, okay, open warfare, I'll say, between local political leadership and the state's public health officials. In other communities, sometimes leadership simply failed to set an example. In San Francisco, the mayor and the public health officer were caught at a boxing match without their masks on, right in the middle of a mask mandate. You can imagine how well that played. And in still other communities, such as Kansas City, Missouri, political conflicts and corruption interfered with the pandemic response. As the Kansas City Star reported in 1918, practically every member of the health and sanitary departments hold their jobs by grace of the bosses. Turns out the Metropolitan Street Railway Company was beholden to them, as were members of the police and fire departments and the city council. Here's the problem. They were beholden to two different bosses, Tom Pendergast and Joe Shannon. And the leaders within the communities with the biggest role to play over public health decisions were embroiled in what became a highly politicized public health squabble. When the pandemic hit Kansas City, Missouri in late September, the city struggled to respond. For instance, when the director of the health department's contagious disease department attempted to impose restrictions early on, his orders were publicly criticized by some members of the Board of Health, and it was countermanded by the health director. 9 days into the pandemic in the city, internecine warfare had kept really any effective controls from being put in place, and those early days matter. Now, ultimately, the city was able to put in place significant restrictions aimed at slowing the pandemic, include an anti-spitting ordinance, the closure of churches and theaters, schools, prohibitions on large public gatherings. They did let the saloons stay open, though. Unfortunately, though they had some good measures in place, they were poorly coordinated, came too late, and were largely dysfunctional. When the armistice was signed on November 11th, the city streets filled with 100,000 celebrants. And by early December, the city was again awash in disease. The failure of local leadership in Kansas City, Missouri cost lives. 100 years later, we've seen the same dispersal over public health decision-making to state and local public health and political leaders, and the same resultant divergence in responses to COVID-19. Though the Surgeon General, who's the head of the United States Public Health Service, has the authority, in fact, to prevent the spread of disease between states, other public health responsibilities, such as hard science, data collection, surveillance, those reside with the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Neither the CDC, has no means to enforce public health measures, and neither does FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, or the Department of Health and Human Services. Instead, as you have already observed and lived through, the federal government is simply limited in its ability to mandate central action. As one group of scholars suggested, this is by design. The COVID-19 response is divided among more than 2,000 state, local, and tribal public health departments. The disparate reactions to this pandemic by state and local public health and political leadership, again, I realize probably familiar to you. What's amazing is how similar it is to 1918. One example would be, of course, these decisions around stay-at-home orders or shelter-in-place orders early in the pandemic. You can see from the map that there was a range of responses. There was also a range of moments when states responded. California's order came on March 19th, Oregon, Washington, March 23rd, Georgia, April 3rd, South Carolina, April 7th. Governor Asa Hutchinson of Arkansas, in fact, refused entirely, as you can see from the map, chose not to put an order in place and actually prohibited mayors in the state who wanted to impose them in their own cities. North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Iowa joined Arkansas in not having a stay-at-home order. In Kansas, your own governor, Laura Kelly, put a state order in place on March 31st. She had attempted to leave the mandates up to local health departments, but recognized that this was creating sort of uneven measures. And she said, the reality is that the patchwork approach that is developed is inconsistent and is a recipe for chaos. And so she acted to bring order to that chaos. But unfortunately, that patchwork approach to public health policies and mandates has continued throughout the pandemic. From closures to the reopening process, from masking mandates to vaccine requirements, there's no consistent policy across the 50 states. Instead, not surprisingly, given the state of law, states, counties, and cities have continued to respond in a wide range of ways. Now, because public health measures really do save lives, the patchwork approach in both pandemics has had consequences. First, importantly, the opportunity to save lives through a fully coordinated response has been missed. Let me say that one again. The opportunity to save lives through a fully coordinated response has been missed. In turn, secondly, the choices made by local leadership has shaped quite profoundly the implications, the experiences for people in their home communities. Let's look at 1918. In that case, the excess death rates for influenza and pneumonia, that's the number of people who died beyond what the number of people who would normally have died in a year of those diseases, in some of the cities I talked about, really revealed the impact of good or not so good public health responses. Two cities I mentioned, Seattle and Milwaukee, fared reasonably well. Kansas City, with its politicized and delayed response, suffered instead a very high excess death rate. In the end, that city had 2,300 deaths, the result of allowing other issues, in this case political conflict, to shape the city's response to the influenza crisis. I call that politicization. Now, if that politicization in Kansas City was the result of machine politics, in countless other communities, the pandemic response was really politicized or shaped by the war. When the pandemic hit in the fall of 1918, the US was in the closing months of World War I. And not surprisingly, given the wartime context, public health advocates often raised the power of their appeals by linking them to the war. In other words, germs and Germans became allies against the United States, and Americans were told that they needed to join the cause against influenza if they hoped to beat Germany. As the mayor of San Diego said, I cannot see a particle of difference between the invasion of France by the heartless, lustful Huns and the invasion of our homes by some epidemic permitted by greed and politics. Those who refused to wear masks were sometimes called slackers, the same phrase used to call out those who refused military service. The message was clear. Each American had a role to play in fighting the pandemic. Such a role was a patriotic duty in this time of crisis, and defeating influenza was both similar to and integral to winning the war in Europe. Now, this way of politicizing the war probably aided the struggle against flu, but in other ways, the politics of the war really interfered with the struggle against influenza, as President Woodrow Wilson in particular placed war interests ahead of public health. Wilson had chosen to fund the war in part through the selling of government bonds, what were called Liberty loans. And Americans faced quite a bit of public and private pressure to buy those bonds to show their support for the war. In the midst of the worst wave of the pandemic in the fall of 1918, with a fourth Liberty Loan drive scheduled to begin, Wilson chose not to delay it. As a result, cities and towns across the country, anxious to show they were patriotic, used large public events to kick off the local drives. Philadelphia has come to serve really as kind of the cautionary tale for the cost of that. On September 28th, the city hosted a massive parade through downtown. Some 200,000 people, or about a ninth of the city's population, turned out. 3 days later, the city counted 635 new influenza cases in a single day, foreshadowing what would prove Philadelphia's catastrophic encounter with the pandemic. Soon, the city's morgues were overwhelmed, resulting in gruesome scenes of what they described as row upon row of unburied dead and the digging of mass graves. The city suffered one of the highest excess death rates in the country. The war politicized the pandemic in a couple of other costly ways as well. First, putting the war ahead of the pandemic in his policies, President Wilson failed to halt troop shipments to Europe, not only encouraging the spread of disease within the US as soldiers traveled to points of embarkation, but also making the work of fighting the war more difficult as well. 30,000 soldiers died of influenza in US training camps, and another 16,000 more perished of influenza in Europe. And perhaps most shocking, President Wilson never spoke publicly of the pandemic, ever. At a moment when 25 million Americans were sickened and more than 500,000 died, he offered no words of guidance, no words of sympathy. It's hard to know what that meant to the American people, but the silence is really quite shocking for us today. Now, in 2020, the United States is not involved in a world war, but that didn't prevent the pandemic from becoming quickly politicized. The politicization of mask wearing offers an easy and obvious example. From the beginning, too, this has had a partisan tenor to it. Democratic leaders were more likely than Republican leaders to urge the wearing of masks as a public health measure and proved much more likely to impose mask mandates. With the opening of school this fall, of course, we're all listening to these debates being renewed. By late August, 8 states had prohibited local governments from imposing mask mandates, and 6 states had limited or prohibited schools from doing so. Among the American people, the partisan divide has played a really large role, it turns out, the largest role in determining who supports or opposes mask wearing. The vast majority of those who vehemently oppose masking mandates are Republicans, of course. And perhaps the most obvious example was President Trump himself. Joe Biden declared early on in the campaign that if elected, he intended to do everything possible to require people to wear masks in public. President Trump chose instead to express doubt about their value. He appeared without one at White House events, at public events. He tended to refuse to be photographed wearing them. And when asked about masks at his rallies, he said, "I recommend people do what they want," a message he reiterated again and again. On April 3rd, 2020, he suggested about donning a mask, "I don't think I'm going to do it. I don't see it for myself." And on August 13th, he suggested, maybe they're great, maybe they're good, maybe they're not so good. And in a presidential debate as late as September 29th, he mocked candidate Biden's wearing of one. So clearly, you can see a vast sort of partisan divide around masks. They had become very much a part of the political landscape. More recently, debates over vaccination have done the same. And what's really interesting is it shows how far beyond the president, or former president, excuse me, this polarization has reached. Experts agree unequivocally, in fact, on the safety and effectiveness of the vaccine. They also agree that there continues to be a sizable number of Americans who are hesitant about or entirely opposed to receiving a vaccine. Now, it's clear the vaccine program was, in fact, initiated by President Trump through Operation Warp Speed. But interestingly, vaccine hesitancy is strongest among Republicans, and in particular among supporters of the former president. By early July 2021, one poll suggested that 86% of Democrats had received at least one shot, while only 45% of Republicans had. And midsummer 2021 polls suggested that between 20 and 30% of Republicans reported they would not get vaccinated, while only 5% of Democrats responded in that way. More hotly debated is the cause for that hesitation. Some suggest the distrust in the federal government is the underlying cause. This point is very well illustrated by the fact that there is a sizable number of people who believe that the vaccines contain tracking chips so that the government can keep track of them. Others point to America's strong streak of libertarianism, the idea that the federal government should not have the right to have this role in an American's life, that an American should have the right to decide whether or not to have a vaccine. The third, though, is the reality that leaders in the Republican Party and many media sites that host them have perpetuated a fair amount of misinformation. Again, this is only some leaders in that party, to be clear, but that has probably played a significant role in fostering suspicion around the vaccines. Now, what I really want to get to, though, is the consequences of the politicization. They're easy to enumerate, but really hard to hear. The partisan divide has led to a situation in which some Americans are more likely to wear a mask and more likely to get a vaccine than other Americans. With the emergency and spread of the Delta variant, a new wave of the coronavirus has swept the country and has been fueled, by the lack of vaccination. So across the country, we are weathering a new round of concern around COVID that's really replaced what we all thought was kind of an exhilarating moment of hopefulness in the early summer. The setback has been frustrating for people regardless of their political position. We are all suffering through this. And the vaccine's proven notably quite effective against this variant. This means, though, that in the simplest terms, opposition to the vaccine brought a renewed wave of disease and a wave that continues to pose a much higher risk of serious illness, hospitalization, and death to those who are not vaccinated, regardless of whether they made this decision by choice or by circumstance. And it's that issue of circumstance I want to end with. I have to turn to the most obvious parallel, the reality that in both 1918 and 2020, 2021, the suffering and trauma in our communities is really immense. And it's differentially distributed, not only by where one lives or the public health measures in your community, or even by one's political beliefs, but also by one's really socioeconomic and racial identity. And this returns us to the stories with which I began. Despite the massive disruption of many of Americans' most basic practices during the 1918 pandemic, one category of behaviors, the adherence to cultural norms and racial and class hierarchies, weathered the storm unchanged. And this created really different experiences tied to a person's social identity. What do I mean? In 1918, the basic problem of the epidemic was made much worse by material need for those who lived in or on the brink of poverty. Imagine somebody in the family gets sick and you have no financial cushion. And that really happened. Here's a story from a family in Minneapolis. In December 1918, influenza struck that family. Father, then mother, then 5 children. The father was out of work for 3 weeks. The family ran out of money to pay for coal to heat their home or for buying groceries. The local store refused to give them credit. The father visited his workplace, found out he'd lost his job. They turned to charity for aid. There was no social safety net. Now, the family's problems didn't start with the pandemic. They were already poor, but their insecure position was made worse because of their bout with influenza. And for people of color, the circumstances were still more difficult. Their experience was framed by the disadvantages of racial prejudice and the broader poverty and segregated healthcare system it produced. African Americans, for instance, struggled against white supremacy even as they fought the flu in 1918. In Chicago, the public health commissioner blamed Black residents arriving through the Great Migration out of the Deep South for the pandemic. In Miami, the city's health officer announced in the first days of the pandemic that Overtown, where the city's Black residents lived, would be far more vulnerable than the rest of the city due to substandard conditions and density. But they did nothing to provide for the neighborhood's residents. Miami City Hospital, a brand new hospital at that point, didn't accept Black patients. And that kind of treatment wasn't a problem only in the South. In Philadelphia, almost the exact same thing took place. None of the city's hospitals that were open to white people did anything, the emergency hospitals, for the Black community. Other communities of color suffered as well. Native Americans and Alaska Natives suffered death rates well above those of others in the country, overall perhaps 4 times those of other Americans. a continuation of the long historical spread of disease and death among indigenous people in the US. Some Alaskan Native communities face devastating infection and death rates. At the Inupiat village of Previg Mission, Alaska, 90% of residents, 72 of the 80 people living there, died in 5 days in November 1918. Destitution, inadequate and crowded housing, lack of healthcare resources, no aid, a long history of poor health conditions, and communication failures by the Indian Health Service all contributed to this horrific outcome. Another place that was hard hit were the Indian boarding schools, which brought their own unique tragedies. The schools, already cruel in their content, in removing children from their homes and their cultures and forcing them in a sense to assimilate, had long been breeding grounds for disease since their founding in the 1880s. A Chamawa Indian school in Oregon, for instance, in the months preceding the epidemic, you can see on this chart all the different kinds of illnesses that children were suffering, from scabies to tonsillitis to tuberculosis. When the pandemic hit, hundreds of children at the school were sickened and several died. At the Haskell Institute, right there in Lawrence, Kansas, almost a third of the students were sickened, even higher than the national sickness rate, and 17 of their students died. In the midst of the pandemic then, the existing structures of prejudice and discrimination continued to operate. Those at the lower rungs of those hierarchies then suffered. Today, we know that the economic and racial disparities of 1918 haven't disappeared. They're different, but they're not gone, and they're landing hard in the midst of COVID. The economic impact of the pandemic, for instance, was immediately disparate, with those already suffering from low incomes the hardest hit. Early evidence has produced predictions of significant growth in the poverty rate, with early estimates suggesting that as many as 10 million Americans may ultimately be added to the poverty roll. The impact of these increases, too, will vary by race, with members of the Black, Latino, Indigenous, and immigrant communities likely to be hardest hit, according to the models. Poverty, in turn, has terrible costs for health. Some scholars suggest that among men, poverty lowers someone's life expectancy by 15 years, and for women by 10 years. Being poor then increases dramatically the likelihood that the individual entered the pandemic already with pre-existing conditions that have proven really significant in how sick people get and whether or not they survive. In turn, being poor enhances the likelihood that a person will live in overcrowded housing or be forced to work in workplaces with inadequate safety precautions. It's no surprise then, but no less an indictment, I'm afraid, of our country's failures in the realm of white supremacy, the people of color dying from COVID-19 in unconscionably high numbers, as the story of Gary Fowler, with which I began, illuminated. Adjusting data from the Center for Disease Control for age differences, the Brookings Institute reported in June 2020 that African Americans were dying at 3.6 times the rate of white people, members of the Latino community at 2.5 times the rate. Disparities in healthcare are, as the report suggests, an enduring fact of American life, and one that sickens and kills people of color every day. And yet, the fact is that COVID-19 has only reinforced that reality. The CDC reported on September 6th, so just last week, that Black people have died at twice the rate of white people over the course of the pandemic to this point, Hispanic and Latino people at a rate of 2.3 times the rate. Indigenous communities too, as you can see here, have reeled under the pandemic, facing losses more than double that of the white community. Again, the result of a broken Indian health service. Among the Navajo or Diné, for instance, diabetes, hypertension, and lung disease are prevalent. And these are preconditions that have really heightened the risks associated with COVID, as has the inadequate healthcare infrastructure. At one point in mid-May 2020, the Navajo Nation had the highest infection rate in the US, and the community's death rate has been high as well. The loss of elders, carriers of language, culture, and memory from many tribal communities has struck a particularly devastating blow. As a spokesman for the Muskogee or Creek Nation lamented, it's like we're having a cultural book burning. We're losing a historical record, encyclopedias. One day soon, there won't be anybody to pass this knowledge down. This tragedy cannot be undone and will have lasting costs. So what does it all mean? The similarities I've outlined over the last half hour or so produce a pretty depressing narrative. I get it. We've repeated many of the costly mistakes of 1918, despite vastly deeper scientific understanding and significant technological advantages. The pandemic has been politicized, fueled by the cultural and political divides that preceded COVID's outbreak. And we've not yet built a truly equitable nation in which one's health is not overly determined by one's wealth or one's racial identity. The result is that more Americans have died than had to, and that sickness, death, and loss have been spread inequitably among us. But what then can this tell us about ourselves and the choices we have and have not made since 1918? What's in here for us to use for the future? Well, our wonder at facing the pandemic, and I shared in this, rest assured, this profound sense that this shouldn't be happening to us, suggests we really haven't yet come to terms with our belief in American exceptionalism, our sense that we can go it alone and that our science is going to save us. In turn, our reliance on the scattershot approach to public health suggests an ongoing unwillingness to accept a vital role for the federal government, a deep suspicion, in fact, of the federal government, even in the context in which a pandemic, a context in which a national response is really far and away the best, the safest. And finally, the racial disparities that this pandemic has highlighted remind us that the nation has hard and crucial work to do to deal with systemic and institutionalized white supremacy, and we still have an inadequate social safety net for poverty. I want to end, though, with a final similarity. Your motto at Washburn University, as I understand it, is not for ourselves alone, a beautiful expression of the kind of communal responsibility that Dr. Martin Luther King articulated in his letter from Birmingham jail, when he reminded Americans we're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. This is literally true in the midst of a pandemic. But what often buoys my spirit is that as I've studied both pandemics, I'm struck by how many people, despite the danger or trauma it involved, attempted to live according to this idea, your school's motto, stepping up to act not for themselves, but especially for others. In 1918, across the country, communities rallied to open emergency hospitals. When schools closed, teachers often turned immediately to volunteer as nurses. And nurses and physicians served with great heroism throughout the pandemic. Lay people did as well, opening soup kitchens, driving ambulances. In Topeka, some of the theater owners continued to pay their employees because they didn't want their help, quote, to suffer through the unforced idleness, end quote. Your local Red Cross sewed pajamas for flu patients at Camp Funston. On campus at Washburn, the Student Army Training Corps Hospital was praised for its embrace of the best practices of the medical profession. And there was a special applause for the leadership and the expert care that was provided by Dr. Jeffrey and the head nurse, Mrs. Bybee, both of whom would have been putting their lives at risk as they provided care to the sick. And with COVID too, we've seen thousands of people step up to serve as frontline workers, to deliver meals, to sew masks. Once again, we have asked far too much of our healthcare providers, people who have suffered not only themselves illnesses and death, but also the wearing down of the soul that the daily hard work of facing this crisis has meant for them. And yet so many of them have kept on. On Vashon Island, where I live, a community of just 10,000 people, a volunteer effort of local healthcare providers and others built a testing site that eventually saw 6,400 volunteer hours over the course of 2020 and 2021, and another 1,500 hours of volunteer service for their vaccine program. On my campus, students have stepped up to get vaccinations or have had those awful swabs stuck up their noses to be tested because they don't want to make someone else sick. I suspect the same is happening on your campus. In the midst of the crisis, we have the chance to act for others, not for ourselves alone, to create, as the scholar Rebecca Solnit describes, a paradise built in hell. And we've seen some of that. We've seen a lot of that. Now, one of the key differences between the people of 19 and ourselves is that their story is done. People like me are going to continue to research and write about them, but they're no longer enacting their history. We are. What we don't yet know is whether we will choose to act on what we are experiencing and as a nation choose to act not for ourselves alone. The pandemic has made visible to us several preconditions: a lack of preparedness, the absence of infrastructure, the ongoing crisis of class and racial inequality, pre-existing conditions that we need to correct. We can do this, I think, if we continue, if we really force ourselves, encourage ourselves, lift ourselves to act according to the ideals of your university and act not for ourselves alone. And it's young folks like you all who make them believe that's possible. Thanks so much. And thank you for this opportunity. And I look forward to answering some questions from all of you soon.
Dr. Bristow, thank you for a truly stimulating and outstanding iREAD lecture. We greatly appreciate your time, and we look forward to asking some of those questions. Students, let me remind you of a couple of things. First of all, let me remind you that events like the iREAD lecture only occur due to the support of groups like the Friends of Maybe Library and the Washburn Women's Venture Partners. Let me also remind you that we come to university to get a degree so we can get a job. But we also come to learn and engage and to be challenged in a way that makes us the leaders that our communities need. That's what Dr. Bristow did today in her iREAD lecture. She asked you to think bigger about who you are going to be as a graduate of Washburn University. And for that, we all owe her a great deal of thanks. We'll see you soon in the classroom. Students, remember, my office is in the Maybe Library on the 3rd floor. If you need help, you come see me. And until you do that, have a really great afternoon. And again, Dr. Bristow, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.